Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with me, Christian Harris. My guest today is Tara Halliday, who is an engineer by trade. She has a PhD in engineering, but for the last 20 years has worked as a coach on high performance. And we talk about two big topics which I feel are very apt for safety and risk professionals: physiological safety and imposter syndrome. So how do we spot these issues? What can we do to overcome them? And what are some of the benefits of doing so? Tara also talks a bit about her new book. That's her second book, and the first one was a bestseller. By the time this comes out, no doubt the second one will be a bestseller too. And she shares some of the resources and the ways that she can help if you feel you want to learn more about these topics. I'm sure you'll get a lot from this episode. I found it fascinating, learnt a lot, and it definitely made me think. So hopefully you have the same reaction. Cheers.
Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with Christian Harris. We believe that proactive safety and risk management powers business performance. Each week we explore this theme, sharing guests, stories, insights, trends, hints and tips. You can find us on all the major podcasting platforms, and video versions are available on YouTube. But for now, let's join the conversation with Christian.
Thanks for joining me today, Tara.
My pleasure, Chris. Lovely to see you.
Yes, you too. And hopefully our lingering coughs and illnesses won't get in the way of today's episode. So we've known each other for a while, but I was keen to get you on for two reasons. Firstly, to talk about kind of what you do, because I think it's really relevant to the audience. But secondly, I saw this article that you wrote recently about physiological safety, and I thought that would also kind of resonate with the audience. So could you just start by giving a bit of a backdrop to that article and talking about, I think you mentioned, physical safety, psychological safety, physiological safety, and kind of the progression of that over time?
Yeah, so there are the safety in the workplace, right? We're talking about, the very basic level, physical safety, and that's where the, safety and risk management industry has grown out of. Excuse me. And so then we get to more recently, people in leadership positions, people in HR have been talking about psychological safety. And psychological safety is the idea that people should feel that they're respected and that their voice can be heard without being attacked, criticized, or bullied. So that's psychological safety. And it's shown to be something that's very good for, people's working environment. It improves the working culture. People feel safer, happier. And then we come to physiological safety, which I haven't really heard people talking about, but it links into the work that I do. And physiological safety is, we're talking about the nervous system. So we're talking about the body's automatic response to a perceived threat. And because the body goes through a whole bunch of changes when it responds to what it perceives as a threat, it affects performance, it affects happiness with their work, satisfaction, and it can increase stress, and it can lead to people burning out and quitting their careers. So it's quite a serious thing, and it's really important to pay attention to that third level of safety as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because it kind of hits on this mega trend of mental health. But, if we cast our minds back 20 years, it's probably something that nobody would ever have even thought about, never mind tried to do anything about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, 20 years ago, even psychological safety was a new idea. So yes, we're definitely progressing.
Yeah. So are there strategies then that we can employ to look to address this? Because obviously if it's a internal reaction to a specific situation, then that's going to be very individual to specific people, I guess, on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's not something that maybe a safety professional or a risk management professional can you can't control how people think, but I guess there are things we can do in terms of preparedness and training the mind and emotional resilience and things like that to sort of manage this.
Yeah, so the very first thing is awareness, right? If we're aware it exists, we're aware that there's a potential solution to a problem, then that already puts us in a more powerful position. First is we need to understand a bit deeper about what's going on, what the issue is in the terms of physiological stress or physiological triggering. So the brain perceives a threat. Now, caveman times, this was a tiger in the room, snake in the grass, those kind of things. And so the body responds. So there's part of the brain called the amygdala that recognizes a threat, and it triggers the nervous system. So it's an automatic response. It's not what we're thinking about. It's not a controlled response at all. The amygdala actually gets information from the senses several milliseconds ahead of the thinking part of our brain. So, and immediately does that, it triggers the nervous system into the traditional fight, flight, and also freeze state. So these are how our bodies would be prepared to respond to a threat in caveman times when it's a life or death situation. So when I talk about physiological safety, I'm talking about the nervous system, that automatic nervous system reaction, and it getting triggered. So then, firstly, what's perceived as a threat? So if there's any kind of intimidation going on, bullying is at an extreme, that will trigger someone's nervous system. And for all the reasons I said, when your nervous system's triggered, the blood flow goes to your muscles. It gets taken away from the logical thinking, planning part of your brain. So you literally can't think as well. You don't perform as well. So this, in terms of business, is why it's so important as well. You're literally not operating at your best, and your team isn't if they get triggered. So the translation into what is going on and what's perceived as a threat is done automatically by the amygdala, and that's the part that we don't have control of. And there are beliefs in there, and we can work with the beliefs, right? So if you want to take it deeper and work with changing those beliefs, that's absolutely possible. That allows people to become the top performers, basically. But if we're talking about how a leader, how a manager can deal with it within their team, for example, in a business environment, it's about recognizing that we have this primal response to anything that's perceived as a threat. So if someone is, so the first is like cut out, make sure that there's no bullying, make sure that there's no intimidation going on. If your automatic reaction to something yourself is a fight response, then that's going to trigger the nervous system of everyone in your team. So what's going on there is our nervous system, because we're social creatures, that's how we evolved. Our nervous systems also take cues from other people's nervous system. So you can imagine being in a restaurant and somebody gasps, right? So every head would whip around and look, right? Not because they're being nosy, but because someone's nervous system has just gone, hey, danger, and everyone's looking to see what that danger might be, if they need to respond. So that's how people's nervous systems can get triggered by any signs of threat. So as a leader, the more calm you can stay, what you'll be communicating, particularly as a leader, is there's no threat here. This space is safe, and keeps the nervous system calm. And there was even in 2013, the Asada Business School in Spain did some research about what makes a transformational leader. So they wired up people's brains to electrodes and measured what was going on in their brains. They wired up their heart and their blood pressure to check their physiological response. And then they had them do a group task. What they were looking for was what makes a transformational leader, what makes, the great. And what they found was that it wasn't that they talked more, it wasn't that they had the best ideas, it was the people who could modulate, calm their nervous system. So it's called neuroregulation, who could regulate their nervous system. Those who could do it best were the ones who were able to be most influential and most powerful as a leader. And so that's the direction that you're looking for to go to help other people's nervous systems.
Interesting. So work on yourself and kind of improve your reactions to these kind of situations on the one hand, and then on the other hand, do something that we have talked about a lot on the podcast, which is be proactive about the kind of inputs to things happening. So prevent the situations that could arise in people having these reactions, just as you try to prevent an accident from happening, rather than dealing with the ramifications of the accident. So sort of a two-pronged approach, if I've understood correctly.
Yeah, and that's really interesting that you can you made that analogy, because people have this phrase, right? It's like a slow motion car crash, right? So we're talking really about safety here. You can see it in a meeting where you can see that everything is starting to, one person's nervous systems get triggered, one gets upset, another person gets upset, and suddenly you have mayhem. So what you as a leader can do is, when you spot that, change direction, de-escalate it, and or you just call a timeout and say, look, we're going to take a 5-minute fresh air break and then come back. So those three things that you can do to interrupt the impending car crash is what's going to keep your team focused and doing the best they can, but also it's going to keep everyone's nervous system as calm as possible.
Yeah, it's really particularly relevant to anybody listening to this or watching this as well, because working in safety and risk, you are dealing with highly charged emotional situations, whether something bad has happened or that there's a perception that something bad is likely to happen, and so we're trying to do something to alleviate that. And so thinking about the emotional reactions to the other people in that situation and how you can kind of mellow those, for want of a better term, is going to be a really, really powerful strategy. Is that something that we're going to talk a bit about your book later, but is that the sort of strategy around that? Is that something that is covered in the book?
Yeah, the first 3 chapters of my book talk about calming the nervous system on the physiological basis, like we're talking about here, tools to get your nervous system calm quickly again. And then the other 2 are calming the coping behaviors that stress drives, and then calming and controlling the triggers that might potentially create stress and therefore trigger your nervous system. So yeah, first 3 chapters are all on that.
Okay. And I mean, you've touched on some of these points already, but what would you say would be the kind of key benefits of getting this right? Perhaps you won't have seen those in this particular setting of safety and risk, but perhaps you could speak a bit more generally about kind of some of the good outcomes, or a couple of examples, case studies or whatever, of where people have worked on this and improved it and some of the benefits they've seen.
Yeah, the benefits we see are very consistent. So when somebody, so I work with leaders and executives, and when they have their nervous system calm, without telling anyone what they've done, not even telling them that they're doing a program, right? People around them notice. I've had, people, someone doing a one-to-one review, and at the end of it, the team member said to the leader, "You seem very different. You seem so much more chill these days," right? And that's the kind of thing. Now, so people notice it, they can feel it, and they, even if they're feeling it, they're noticing it at a subconscious level. It's that you've communicated to their nervous system. So people feel safer, literally like safer, and that means that they are less defensive and more cooperative. They one of the things that a triggered nervous system has done, a Princeton University study showed that when you trigger a nervous system, you lose 13 points of IQ. Right now, your IQ, the average is 100. Most people sit between the 75 and 125. So 13 points is a lot to lose. So if you imagine your team is stressed, then, and their nervous system's triggered, then they're not there to perform as well. And there's also, in terms of creativity, when your nervous system's triggered, you're 50% less creative. So if you've got people that you need to be problem solving, then anything that you can do to get them in a calm, relaxed state, you know, they don't have to be singing and dancing and clapping and things like that, but they need to be in this calm nervous system state, will improve their performance and also improve the whole culture at work, which will then, and the knock-on effect of that is retention, and then you don't have the costs of rehiring, retraining. You know, in a business sense, it's a big deal.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I definitely can buy into that. And I like the example of having that one-to-one and somebody being more chilled. I mean, I would say for me personally, I'm probably on the fight, flight, or freeze. I'm probably more on the freeze end of the spectrum. So I think I kind of would, you know, I think people would feel I'm quite chilled, but I think I would become a bit more withdrawn in that kind of scenario. And so then it's probably slightly different, that I would need to try to get myself out of that a bit more.
That's it. So the way you deal with freeze is different to the way you deal with fight or flight. In the freeze state, it's kind of a lockdown, frozen, literally frozen. And so it's all about getting movement and flow back into your physiology, right? And then, so what people perceive when you're used to freeze and you're not freezing anymore, they'll see you as more open, more warm, more approachable. They'll be more receptive to any mentoring that you do, any training that you do, because they'll feel like they connect better to you because you're literally not withdrawn. So yeah, still a good thing to do.
There we go. You've got a free coaching session. Good stuff. Really interesting, and I think people can take a lot away from that. The other topic I was keen to talk about with you was, and I know these two topics do overlap, but anyway, was imposter syndrome, because that's kind of how I first became aware of you battling against imposter syndrome, and I feel as if this is something that can afflict safety and risk professionals, particularly from the perspective of, let's think of a couple of scenarios. So, you know, I've just been promoted, but am I up to this job? I'm only the safety person, you know, the board won't listen to me. How can I solve this problem? Because I need to get investment, but I don't know how to speak their language. It's sort of scenarios like that where there's this feeling of kind of being a bit less than. And so I thought exploring this might be, you know, powerful thing for people to get. So should we start by just kind of defining what this kind of imposter syndrome is?
Yes. So imposter syndrome is the secret feeling of being a fraud when you're not a fraud, and the fear of being found out. The two goes together. And it affects over 70% of high achievers at some point in their lives. So it's something that people keep a secret because they think it's a personal flaw or weakness, and they don't want to expose the fact that they're feeling like they're not quite good enough. But it's not. And there is something you can do about it. So that's really the big messages about what imposter syndrome is.
Yeah. And I know when we spoke before, you had a good example of, I think it was a lawyer, sort of a story, and perhaps you could talk me through that, because I think that's quite a powerful backdrop.
Yeah, so this is Daniel. He was a lawyer who's very successful early in his career in the north of England, and he was in the newspaper for getting, you know, real good success with certain cases. And he got headhunted by a excuse me, a high-profile, prestigious law firm in London. And so he moved then to London, and the first thing he did was start comparing himself to his new colleagues. And what he found was that they all seemed to be second and third generation lawyers and barristers. They all had gone to expensive private schools, where he went to a state school. They went to prestigious universities. He went to his local university. And so he felt he was so different from them, and he felt that he wasn't quite good enough. And that's the feeling of imposter syndrome. He had no one to share this with. His family thought he was, the golden boy off to the big city making his fortune, right? And so he felt very isolated and very alone. He felt like he didn't belong. Some of the behaviors that he did start getting praise early on, because he was good, right? He wasn't trying to pretend he was what he isn't. And but he would deflect the praise, and he would say, oh, I just got lucky, oh, it's just good timing. And that kind of deflecting praise from point of imposter syndrome is like defensive. It's not like he's being humble, right? It's not like he's just being polite. He genuinely didn't believe that he was good enough to have got the results, and was worried that if people started believing he was good enough, then they'd forever expect their demands would go higher and higher and higher, and at one point he would fail. So that was behind it. He would over prepare for cases, so he'd spend very long hours, and every day he would go in to the office thinking, today's the day they're going to fire me. Right? And so he was massively stressed by all of this, working long hours. He started getting sick, and after only 2 months he said, enough is enough, and I quit. So he quit not only his job in London, but also the entire career. 15 years later, he came back as a legal assistant, and then now he has a one-man band law firm. So in terms of what he could have accomplished, there's a big difference, and the reason that he quit was he was burnt out. And so, and all of this was driven by imposter syndrome, because he had the brain power, he had the education and the capacity to do really well in this career, and so all he was left with was regret. So that's not an untypical scenario of somebody who gets really overwhelmed by imposter syndrome such that they take drastic action.
It's terrible, isn't it, when you hear of stories like that? It just makes you think, what could have been, and again underscores this whole mental health piece that we were talking about. So
well, that's why I do this, right? That's my passion, because I see this and it's completely unnecessary suffering. Right? I mean, Daniel really did suffer badly through all of that and afterwards, and for the rest of his life it haunted him. And because we can do something about it, it's not something anyone has to put up with, and that's why I'm motivated to do what I do.
Yeah, and the people who are joining us in this conversation are going to have a very similar passion about keeping people safe and well too. So that will absolutely resonate with them, I'm sure. So the sort of root causes then of this imposter syndrome, I'm guessing, are kind of unconscious, but we need to sort of try and identify those and then address the root causes. Is that kind of the way we would go about trying to solve the problem?
Yeah, well, the first part is understanding the symptoms of it. So there's 3 symptoms. One of the symptoms is the imposter syndrome thinking, which is feeling you're not quite good enough, you don't belong, people's going to find you out, and self-criticism, self-judgment. The second symptom is the physiological stress that thinking causes. And we've talked a bit about physiological stress, but the physiological stress causes people to feel anxious or overwhelmed. It can affect sleep and energy levels, and obviously trigger you into fight, flight, and freeze. And chronic stress is, can affect your health as well. That physiological stress then triggers you to try and cope with it with various behaviors, and these are some of the things that Daniel was doing. So there's behaviors that will keep you out of the spotlight, like procrastination, not speaking up quite enough, avoiding opportunities and deflecting praise. Or the behavior is, if you're feeling like not quite enough, you try and make yourself enough. So you try and push through. And those are perfectionism, comparing, over preparing, chasing unneeded qualifications. And then with those behaviors, because they're driving you, they're driven by stress, they're got this automatic, slightly out of control feel, and they're not productive, you then judge yourself. You think it's part of your personality, and that feeds into the thinking. So you're going round and round in a cycle. Now, those are the symptoms that people will see in themselves, or not everyone has all of them. Everyone's got their own particular profile.
Yeah.
So the root cause of imposter syndrome is actually a belief that is unconscious and is reinforced by the amygdala because it perceives it as a threat. So this is why we get triggered. And that belief is that your worth as a person varies depending on what you do. You do something good, you are a good person. You do something bad, you are a bad person. And this is where the perception of threat comes in, because in our, ancient societies, we were safe in a group, right? And any human being that tried to live by themselves was too exposed, and it was a death sentence.
Yeah.
So that feeling of not belonging in the group, although it sounds kind of soft, the brain perceives it as life-threatening danger, and this is why it triggers all of those symptoms.
Yeah, it's fascinating delving into this stuff, because you sort of, as you're speaking, I'm thinking to myself, I recognize some of these traits in other people, and I perhaps recognize some of them occasionally in myself. And I guess it's going to make people think, isn't it? Which is the point. That I suppose part of our role is to try to recognize it in ourselves if we're showing any signs, but also try and recognize it in other people and help them.
Yeah, recognizing it in other people will be harder because most people keep this a secret.
Yeah, although some of the kind of so when you were talking about striving for qualification after qualification and things like that, that made me think, oh yeah, there's a few people where perhaps that,
yes,
I've seen that behavior exhibited, and that maybe that's what's been driving it.
Yes. So that's one of the ones that you can see. But when I work with my clients and then they later start talking about it with others, the most common reaction was, oh, I had no idea you were feeling that. I thought you were so confident. So it's not a lack of confidence we're talking about here.
No.
It's the feeling that you're not quite good enough, and then your brain says, hey, that's bad. That's a dangerous situation to be in.
Is there any link to sort of introvert versus extrovert spectrum on this kind of stuff, or not? Just out of interest.
There actually isn't.
Okay.
So if we're talking about like physiological safety then, and what triggers things, fears, right? So if you look at the introversion extroversion scale, is really where people get their energy from. So an introvert will feel recharged by having some time and space alone, or with a few number of people. And the more introverted they are, the more space recharges them. The extroverts get that recharge by interacting with other people, right? And so the stronger the extrovert, the more they enjoy interacting with other people. Now, when you add the fear into it, so this is the physiological stress and the danger, the introverts will start, when you have some physiological stress, then you'll need to recharge more, and it'll be more imperative for you to recharge, such that you'll start avoiding different situations. So an introvert will start avoiding crowds, and an extrovert will start avoiding being alone. So it's just different ways of doing it. But the researchers into imposter syndrome looked for maybe 30-40 years into what is the personality traits of someone with imposter syndrome, and their conclusion after all of that was, it's nothing to do with your personality. And that reinforces the idea that this is just a belief, a concept
Yeah.
that's held in the brain, and it's not who you are. And that's a really important point.
Yeah. So two questions then that hopefully will be helpful for the audience. One would be what we can do as leaders to help people in our team to kind of see this in themselves and then address it. So how can we kind of be supportive in that way? And then the second would be, if we're kind of listening to this and recognizing that this might be something that is a problem for us, what can we do about it ourselves?
Okay, so there's a few things here. So there are two things that you can do to help with imposter syndrome, whether it's other people or it's you. We can either manage the symptoms, which just dials down the stress of it, dials down the impact of it, which means that people can cope a lot better, and that's helpful. That doesn't get rid of imposter syndrome, it just dials it down. It might flare up in stressful situations. The other thing we can do, which is the work that I do, which is eliminating it for good by changing the way that the brain perceives this situation as a threat. So we're changing the belief. When that happens, all the symptoms just fall away because the driver has gone. So that leaves people feeling effortlessly confident, right? Not arrogant, but they just forget to doubt themselves. And so they approach things as, well, this is interesting, you know, do I want to do this or not? People have more choice, they're more in control of their lives, and they have this kind of natural resilience. They're not taking things personally. So those are the two things you can do. As a leader, first being aware of it, educating yourself on it helps, because then you'll start to see it, as you say, in, for example, the people with the unneeded qualification. Someone comes to you and say, oh, look, you know, this is, you know, third year in a row, and they're asking for funding for a new qualification. That might be an, oh, that's interesting, you know, because it's not needed. So you can start to see it everywhere. And the other then is to point them in the right direction and say, look, here here's things you can do to manage it, point them into courses and things, and here's things that you can do to eliminate it. So being aware of it is the first part. And the other really is, you know, is circle back to what we say around physiological safety, right? The very best thing you can do is focus on the physiological safety, because it reduces that nervous system stress. So, and that helps damp down the feeling of imposter syndrome. And I suppose the very other thing to do is do whatever you can to foster a sense of belonging in a team. Be very aware when people withdraw, because as we said earlier, that might be the freeze response, right? Be aware, you know, see whatever you can do to help people feel included. And then this goes back to the psychological safety, the workplace culture, things like that.
Yeah, culture, safety culture is a big thing.
Yeah.
So you touched a bit on some of the kind of solutions, so that's a good segue into talking a bit more about what you specifically do. And I think you've got lots and lots of kind of resources and things, but you've got a quiz, haven't you, which might be, is that a good starting point for people?
It's a great starting point. Yeah, it's a free quiz. It's just 20 questions, and it'll give it's completely anonymous, and it'll give you feedback on as to where you stand in terms of imposter syndrome, and give you an idea if this is something you really, you know, should address, because, you know, that's people hope that it'll go away in time. Often people think that imposter syndrome is a beginner's issue. It's because I'm just learning. That's actually not the case. It affects highly skilled people at the top of their field, and it just doesn't go away. So, you know, if you know that your score on that quiz is high, then it's time for you to do something about it for your benefit and for the benefit of everyone around you. So yeah, that's the quiz.
Okay, so that'll be good. So we'll definitely include the link for that, and then talk a bit about the book, and then where people can get that, and then kind of if people wanted to take it a stage further and learn more about working with you, how kind of would that all work?
Yeah, okay, so my book has just been published, which I'm thrilled about. It's called Outsmart Imposter Syndrome, and it basically goes through the step-by-step process of what I take people through to eliminate imposter syndrome for good. So I've recognized that the work that I do, I can only do on a one-to-one basis. I have a small team of other coaches who I've trained, but the problem's much bigger than us. So what I've done is I've laid out all the secrets of exactly how to do this in my book. I still recommend you use someone, a coach, to help you through it, but it's there for people who won't do that. And as we said, the first 3 chapters are all about getting the brain to a calm state such that we can then change it. So that's the book. And then where you go from there are 2 things. As I said, you can manage the symptoms, and I have a small online course. We can put the link to that, and that's a do-it-yourself video course with exercises, worksheets, and what you come out with is a plan for you to help dial down the stress of imposter syndrome. And then the eliminating it for good, that's a one-to-one program with me, and that changes the way that the amygdala perceives the threat, and that gives these huge transformational results.
Perfect. Well, loads and loads of resources there. We'll include all those links, and people can, feel free to dive in. But I hope that, and I'm sure that people will have learned a lot from today. So thanks very much, Tara. That's been really, really insightful, and we've tried to put as much as we can, a bit of a spin on this topic, which affects all sorts of people for the audience of the podcast. So I really do appreciate it.
It's an absolute pleasure. And I think your point earlier about that joint focus on people's safety, well-being, health, and happiness, that's a very very human drive, and it's very prevalent in the safety and risk management industry, and it's an absolute delight. So this is my pleasure.
Definitely. Good stuff. Well, thanks very much. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you again on the next episode.
Thanks for joining us on the Safety and Risk Success podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please hit follow and do share on social media. Does anyone you know spring to mind as a great guest, even yourself? If so, please contact us on podcast@slipsafety.co.uk. See you next week for another episode.